This is film one, Before the Flood and an Inconvenient sequel. If you could know the truth about the threat of climate change, would you want to know? This is the question posed by the National Geographic film Before the Flood, which features Leonardo Dicaprio. It's a great question that throws down the gauntlet to potential viewers, as hitting the pause button would obviously answer with a decided no. Though, presumably, you would not have even purchased or clicked on the film if you did not want to know the truth. But what is the truth? And as a filmmaker, how do you present it in about an hour and a half? Keep in mind that we're not talking about how to present one aspect of the climate crisis, such as wildfires or climate migration, but the whole shebang, from the fact that Miami is now flooding on sunny days to the disturbing fact that fossil fuel interests are spending millions of dollars trying to convince the public that the climate isn't changing. The approach that the film takes is interesting and arguably pretty effective. You introduce the audience to a protagonist, Leonardo Dicaprio, who wants to know about the truth of the climate crisis and sets to find out, in this case by traveling the world in search of answers. Along the way, he talks with people as diverse as Barack Obama, Pope Francis, Elon Musk, Dr. Sunuta Lorraine, and incidentally, Lorraine, who really takes the U.S. to task in the film for failing to lead in the crisis, is the director of India's Center for Science and the Environment. In a sense, Dicaprio acts as a surrogate for the viewer, who also wants to know the answer to the question with which I opened. If you could know the truth about the threat of climate change, would you want to know? If you answer yes by not hitting pause, then buckle in, as you and Dicaprio are embarking on an epic whirlwind journey. Incidentally, the climate footprint for all this travel and production was, according to the filmmaker, quote, offset through voluntary carbon tax, unquote. This general approach is incidentally used by a range of environmental films, from Gasland to Cowspiracy. In Gasland, Josh Fox's family receives a letter from a gas company wanting to lease property to set up a fracking operation on it. Knowing little or nothing about hydraulic fracturing, Fox then sets out on a journey for looking for answers, with you, the viewer, along for the ride. Similarly, in Cowspiracy, you and Kip Anderson embark on a quest to learn about the environmental impact of eating animal products. A little trivia here, just in case you're interested, Leonardo DiCaprio has long been a committed environmental activist. He was the executive producer of Cowspiracy. So are Fox, Anderson, and DiCaprio really as uninformed as their on-screen personas appear? Probably not. Still, what do you think? Is this an effective rhetorical device? Before the Flood, the approach is notably somewhat different. Unlike Josh Fox in Gasland, Leonardo DiCaprio's online persona is not professing ignorance of the situation. He hardly can, as early in the film he draws attention to the fact that in 2014 he was appointed as the UN climate ambassador. Still, he acknowledges that, since he is hardly an expert in the climate crisis, he has much to learn. He then sets out to learn it, with viewer in tow. In both an Inconvenient films by Al Gore, he takes an entirely different approach. Gore's 2006 documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, was a phenomenon. Although it is not in the top 10 highest-grossing documentaries of all time, it's number 11. Partly on the merit of that film, Gore was awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize, along with 1,500 scientists of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Gore received half of the prize, the scientists split the other half. A good deal of An Inconvenient Truth was given to establishing Gore's credibility. No, he is not a scientist, but he has been working on the climate crisis since the 1970s. He also works with a range of climate scientists. In short, the film hopes to make clear that you should listen to him, as he is presented as the right person to deliver this message. In Gore's 2017 follow-up to An Inconvenient Truth, aptly named An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power, the filmmaker largely takes the same approach by working to establish Gore as an internationally recognized expert. In contrast, early on in Before the Flood, Leonardo Dicaprio wonders if the UN did the right thing in appointing him as their climate ambassador. As he baldly puts it, to be honest, they may well have picked the wrong guy. If you've watched Before the Flood and an Inconvenient sequel, I'm curious to hear what you think about these different approaches. One of the reasons that the iconic and inconvenient truth is not our option is because a great deal has changed in the years since, with the climate, since 2006. For example, while Gore was correct in asserting in the film that climate change played a role in exacerbating Hurricane Katrina, and that's the 2005 storm that devastated Florida and Louisiana, killing 1,200 people, scientists now have a much clearer understanding of how this works. And sadly, there have been a range of horrific storms since Katrina, like Superstorm Sandy and Hurricanes Matthew, Harvey, Irma, Michael, Maria, Dorian, and the list goes on and on. An Inconvenient sequel also takes on the job of introducing viewers to the politics lurking behind all this, which Gore, a former vice president for 2 terms, is obviously in a position to know a good deal about, including visiting a Texas city with a Republican mayor who firmly believes in renewable energy. The film also introduces the viewer to COP21, where the Paris Agreement was signed, taking us there with Gore. Another little piece of trivia, after its premiere at the Sundance Film Festival, an Inconvenient sequel was edited to include Donald Trump's announcement that he would withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. And included in there is Gore's responses to that Trump statement. Before the Flood and an Inconvenient sequel are different films with very different approaches. They both take on, nonetheless, the formidable job of communicating the breadth of the climate crisis to viewers in about an hour and a half. I'm curious to hear what you think of each, or both of these, if you've watched each and are thinking about the two of them together. So let's get into the class discussion of Before the Flood and an Inconvenient sequel. As usual, note that the following observations, which are in italics in the written form of this, have not been paraphrased or altered, although I do correct the occasional typo, and because of space concerns, often just part of the comment is reproduced here along with my reply. In working through these, I will first quote a student's observation, followed by thoughts. First quote. In one of the introductory videos, Ken stated that the first few weeks of the class are undeniably depressing, and this could not have been any more true. When reading The Uninhabitable Earth, I was completely shocked by the devastating future Wallace Wells illustrated through his reading. But after watching the film Before the Flood, my shock and fear have been cemented due to the visuals that the documentary provided on the devastation that's already happening. I find it completely devastating and corrupt how the individuals and countries who contributed least to the problem are the ones who will be suffering the most. As the world leader it claims to be, the United States needs to take charge in addressing this issue and investing in solutions. And that's close quote. Before the Flood does indeed contain some incredibly powerful images. A few decades ago, all that we had to go on were projections and mathematical models from scientists. Now, unfortunately, the climate crisis is here. Consequently, if you travel across the earth, you will see its impact in one way or another nearly everywhere, which is, of course, exactly what Leonardo DiCaprio does in Before the Flood. And if you travel across the earth, one thing will be immediately clear, is that the suffering brought about by the climate crisis was already unevenly and very unjustly felt. This ranges from all sorts of plants and animals who obviously had no role in the crisis, yet are already suffering, and in some cases actually going extinct. And then there are all sorts of people on Earth who did virtually nothing to contribute to the climate crisis. It's one thing to mention this as a fact, that the poorest 3 billion people on the planet have only contributed 5% of greenhouse gases that human beings have put into the atmosphere. That's just a fact. But it's another thing altogether to see a farmer in India point to his field, which is entirely underwater, having been destroyed by a flood. Finally, we come to the cause of the climate crisis, the relatively small number of wealthy countries and individuals who are bringing it about, but are, ironically, generally suffering the least. Which of course brings us to the United States and this student's suggestion that we need to, quote, take charge in addressing this issue and investing in solutions. After all, how did the United States get to be so wealthy and powerful? Sometimes Americans think that this is just a natural occurrence, as we are imagined as being, just that special. However, our success, power, and wealth came from 200 years of the unchecked burning of fossil fuels from our fossil fuel economy. Hence, the only thing to do is to use our power and wealth to do what we can to correct this problem. In other words, because we are, more than any other country on Earth, responsible for bringing about this crisis, we need to take the lead in solving it. Next comment. The climate crisis is a topic that has a tendency to make me feel like I'm face down in the dirt with hands tied behind my back. What an image. Though this means that it feels like no matter how much I want to fix the issue of climate change, I feel like my personal actions won't amount enough to make a significant difference. End of the quote. Lying face down in the dirt, hands tied behind your back. Now that's a strong image. I want to address this feeling of being completely and utterly helpless in the face of something unimaginably huge and seemingly inevitable. And not just as a response to our weekly documentary, but as a response to the climate crisis. I completely understand this response to what is bearing down on us. I get the response. However, the goal of Climate Crisis 101 is to, in a manner of speaking, untie your hands and get you up and hopefully mobilize. It's true that, quote, our personal actions won't amount to enough to make a significant difference, in the sense that if all of us gave up beef and driving cars, it would not be enough. It's not that it wouldn't be good to do these things. It's absolutely positively would. It's just that there are other sorts of actions that we can and should be taking. Bigger actions, political actions, collective actions. Moreover, because the required actions are so big, what could one person possibly do? This brings us back to the feeling of helplessness. But there's the possibility that one seemingly insignificant person can, in fact, do a great deal. Consider Greta Thunberg or AOC. Moreover, if you get enough people together, they can do amazing things. Consider the Sunrise Movement. The important thing to do is to do something, or at least try. Aside from the fact that you may be successful, let's hope that you are, doing so is important because it can help, reduce the feeling of helplessness. Seriously, it can. The next quote. In particular, I really enjoyed the section with Sunuta Lorraine. I believe that it gives a completely different perspective on the use of renewable energy than those that are traditionally portrayed in mainstream media. While India as a country is the third biggest polluter behind China and the United States, it's important to note that per capita, one U.S. citizen is equivalent to 34 India citizens when it comes to their carbon footprint. I believe that Narain makes an extremely important point that the U.S. should be the leader when it comes to using renewable resources. Our country certainly has more than enough financial means to do so. So it's unfair to blame developing countries like India when looking at carbon emissions. So Having shown Before the Flood to a number of students, nearly everyone's favorite part is not, as you might imagine, the interview with Elon Musk in his car factory, but rather the interview with Dr. Sunuta Narain, the director of India's Center for Science and the Environment. Narain really takes Dicaprio and by extension the United States to task for not leading during the climate crisis. If you stand back and think about it, what Narain is in essence prompting us to do is rather absurd. It is rather absurd that the largest contributor to the climate crisis, the United States, is critical of the way that a poor country like India is approaching the situation. How indeed can we ask India to take action when we are not doing so ourselves, especially when we have the wealth and power to, for example, shift to renewables, which India simply cannot afford to do? Consequently, Narain and the student's comments are squarely on the mark. I'll requote the student here. Our country certainly has more than enough financial means to do so, so it's unfair to blame developing countries like India when looking at carbon emissions. The next comment. Watching the Fox News anchors roast Leonardo Dicaprio so viciously just for trying to bring attention to the scientifically proven phenomena of climate change was extremely disheartening. The way that the largest news corporation in America just constantly denies the existence of climate change in the first place sets the tone for how difficult advocating for structural changes in the United States. Elected officials purposely misled their constituents to believe that this is a made-up phenomenon and continue to make it a problem. In so doing, continue to make it a problem for future generations. It is indeed a sad state of affairs in America today that if you attempt to pop your head up and call for action on the climate crisis, you present yourself as a target to be smacked down. Given his wealth and celebrity, Leonardo DiCaprio is an easy target. However, it really doesn't seem to matter much who you are, as speaking out about the climate crisis can open you up to ridicule and attack. When Greta Thunberg gave a moving, impassioned talk at the UN Climate Summit in 2019, the then President of the United States, Donald Trump, tweeted that her speech was, quote, so ridiculous. Greta must work on her anger management problem. Then go to a good old-fashioned movie with a friend. Chill, Greta, unquote. Okay, aside from the fact that the most powerful person on the planet attacked and ridiculed a 16-year-old, Thunberg came under fire simply for being angry about the climate crisis, for being angry about the fact that Donald Trump and his generation of wealthy individuals, which brought about the crisis, were not doing anything about it. In other words, more than anyone else at the summit, an angry Greta Thunberg was speaking to Trump, imploring him to do something, anything about the crisis. His response was to ridicule her and tell her to, quote, chill. This is all the more reason, as far as I'm concerned, to respect and admire people like Thunberg and DiCaprio for having the courage to speak out. So the next comment. Before the flood truly put into perspective the depth and scope of the climate crisis, it also added to things that I learned in Environmental Studies 1, which I found insightful. I think that everyone should see this as it comes from a relatively neutral perspective. Aside from being against oil companies, overall a 10-10 watch and a harsh reality check for the inhabitants of Earth, unquote. There are two important points here, really important ones. First, even if you're familiar with the climate crisis, for example, if you've already taken a course like Environmental Studies 1 at UCSB, there's always still more for us to learn. This includes everyone, including me. And it's especially the case with the climate crisis, along with the understanding of it, because it's evolving so quickly. Second, the observation that Before the Flood, quote, takes a relatively neutral position, unquote, strikes me as both correct and perhaps intentional on the part of the filmmakers. As to why the filmmakers took this approach, I suspect that it has to do with their imagined audience. Before the Flood was released in theaters on October 21, 2016. It was also made available for free between October 30th and November 6, 2016 on the National Geographic Channel. Given November 6th was Election Day, when Donald Trump was elected President of the United States, we can conjecture, and I'm just guessing here because I really don't know for sure, that the filmmakers were hoping to influence at least some people who may have still been undecided to vote with the climate crisis in mind. If your imagined audience are people who are not yet convinced of the validity or severity of the climate crisis, and who may, in fact, have already been influenced by arguments put forward by fossil fuel affiliates, taking a relatively neutral position makes a good deal of sense. In other words, if you just lay out the facts in as neutral a way as possible, given that the facts here are just so compelling, it will allow someone who may be a little skeptical to make up their minds without feeling that they are being, influenced by partisan interests. Since some people are immediately skeptical of Al Gore because he is a liberal politician, it just makes sense to have a relatively neutral spokesperson like Leonardo Dicaprio discovering a range of disturbing facts about our changing climate. So the next comment. I found the pairing of the movie with our reading of The Uninhabitable Earth to be very effective as the two balance each other out. DiCaprio's solution is a technological one, investing in green energy, building gigafactories, while Wallace's approach emphasizes the inability of technology to solve each and every one of our problems. In Wallace's book, he talks about the negative impact capitalism has on our environment and how it's difficult to see a way out of the crisis without a fundamental shift in our way of life, a stance similar to that of the activist and author Sunita Narain DiCaprio talks to in India. Close quote. Yeah, this is an apt observation. Although there are a variety of ways that we can mitigate the climate crisis, they often fall into two general camps, though these two are often intertwined. Solutions that are either technological or cultural. Perhaps nowhere is the technological approach more concisely presented than when Leonardo DiCaprio interviews Elon Musk in his Gigafactory and Before the Flood. What will it take to mitigate the climate crisis? According to Musk, quote, we actually did the calculations, what it would take to transition the whole world to sustainable energy, 100 gigafactories, close quote. Leonardo DiCaprio voices the response of the audience when he exclaims in wonder, that's it? That sounds manageable? I wonder how many people slept better after hearing that. However, as David Wallace Wells makes clear, the situation is far more complex than that. Allow me to again quote this student's apt observation, as in many ways it is an equally concise presentation of the cultural approach to mitigating the climate crisis. Quote, in Wallace's book, he talks about the negative impact capitalism has on our environment and how it is difficult to see a way out of this crisis without a fundamental shift in our way of life, a stance similar to that of activist and author Sunita Narain, who Leonardo DiCaprio talks to in India. Close quote. Climate Crisis 101 takes the position that, although technology will absolutely play a major role here, quote, a fundamental shift in our way of life is also required. The next quote. For this week's reading Before the Flood, I was expecting to learn a lot of new information about the climate crisis, but I never imagined it would have been this enlightening. It felt like I had personally joined Leonardo DiCaprio on his journey across the world to discover ways to make the changes that we need. There were so many statistics and visuals that I found very interesting. Speaking as someone who enjoys a good burger, when Leonardo DiCaprio addressed the agricultural aspect of climate change, I was fascinated but disheartened. Close quote. Whenever I speak to the public about the cultural changes that will be necessary to mitigate the climate crisis, I've noticed that sooner or later, for one reason or another, most people in the audience will, to use this person's words, go from being fascinated to disheartened. The issue here doesn't involve concern over impacts of the climate crisis like sea level rise or wildfires, but rather what's mitigating this crisis, what it will involve for each of us personally. In my response to the previous comment, I noted that technology alone will not solve this problem. Rather, we need to engineer significant cultural changes. This may sound fine in theory, but what does it mean in practice? For example, what if you are, as this person noted, quote, someone who really enjoys a good burger, close quote, or someone who enjoys air travel to exciting locales, or someone who really loves cars or clothes? When I talk about these particular issues to live audiences, when I get to the climate impact of air travel, some people in the room become visibly uncomfortable. The same happens to other people when I shift to talk about automobile use or fast fashion. Still other people become uncomfortable when I take up beef and burgers. Unfortunately, as I noted in response to the previous comment, it is not the case that technology alone will solve the problem. One way or another, it will eventually hit home for each of us. Although this may seem, that it will not require us to give up things that add value to our lives, it's important to think about the downside here. So, experts argue that eating beef is not just unhealthy, but eating enough of it can take a year or more off of your life. Automobiles injure or kill over 50 million people annually. And having a full closet of clothes, does it really make you happy? Next comment. When watching Before the Flood, I went through a range of emotions. The film was overwhelming. It was infuriating, frustrating, and sad. I drew from the film that what really needs to be addressed are big corporations and government. While I am not trying to scapegoat them and only blame them because, we as consumers fuel their interests, corporations and the government have a much bigger weight on the climate change than I do. The actions of big companies, lobbyists, and spineless politicians are criminal, close quote. This comment wonderfully and aptly cycles through a range of emotions and their cause. First, the climate crisis is overwhelming, as it is causing, one major problem after another. However, shifting to the next emotion, what is especially infuriating, frustrating, is that big corporations and the government are not addressing the problem. The United States government has known about the dangers of the climate crisis ever since the 1960s, when the then president, Lyndon Johnson, addressed Congress about the issue. Since then, virtually nothing has been done about the problem. Regarding corporations, although it will be easy to just focus on the fossil fuel industry and its affiliates, all sorts of corporations are now powerful entities in the world. If Apple Computer were a country, it would be the 8th richest country in the world, surpassing Russia, Canada, Italy, and nearly every other country on Earth. Other countries, such as Amazon and Microsoft, are not far behind. Although this began at the close of the 19th century with fossil fuel providers, such as oil companies and heavy industry like steel production, all sorts of corporations benefited during the era of the fossil fuel economy. To put it simply, wealthy countries and wealthy corporations amassed enormous amounts of wealth during the era of the fossil fuel economy. Because carbon pricing, such as a carbon tax, was not in effect during this time, none of these countries or corporations were taxed or penalized for carbon emissions into the atmosphere. It's astonishing, really. Moreover, it could be argued that during the last 40 years, especially, corporations of all sorts have not been paying nearly enough in taxes to wealthy countries like the United States. Consequently, as the comment noted, what is, quote, infuriating and frustrating is that big corporations and governments are not addressing the problem. Our next comment concisely teases out this frustration. Quote, "The capitalist greed for short-term profit will continue to hurt our future if policies are not made to crack down on corruption and enforcement better. Actions like a carbon tax." Close quote. We're going to talk more about this issue throughout Climate Crisis 101, but it's worth noting something now, even though we will expand on this particular issue later. When people draw attention to problems with capitalism, as does this comment, it does not at all follow that they are suggesting that we throw it out the window. Fossil fuel and affiliates and climate change deniers will sometimes argue that calling for reform of our current system is really a secret attempt to resurrect the failed communist experiments, and that would be like Soviet Russia and Mao's China of the 20th century. However, what we're really talking about here is the unchecked, consumerism and capitalism that's playing a significant role in hastening climate change. In order to reel this in, we need a strong government, i.e. a strong democracy, to enact legislation to protect people on the planet from, to use this person's words, quote, "greed for short-term profits." Simply put, we need to put people on the planet first, not corporations and their profits. So the next comment. I believe the film Before the Flood was a great intro to the issue. However, more in-depth environmental films could also be useful in addition, close quote. I too wish that we had time for more films that took up a range of environmental and climate issues. However, I tried to show films that in some ways seemed essential. That said, there are a number of terrific documentaries that consider specific issues that are worth watching, such as Gasland, which is about hydraulic fracturing, aka fracking, Racing Extinction, about climate loss, A Plastic Ocean, about the polluting of our oceans with plastic, Chasing Ice, the loss of our planet's glaciers and ice, Chasing Coral, the death of our planet's coral. Okay, next comment. Before the Flood is a captivating documentary that I could barely take my eyes off once I began watching. I am not generally the type of person who cares a great deal about what celebrities are up to, what products they're using, who they're dating, and so forth. Which is why I was pleasantly surprised at how Leonardo Dicaprio presents himself in a humble and approachable way and learns and grows with the audience rather than coming off as pretentious. Close quote. Americans have an undeniable fascination with celebrities. To quote this person, what products they're using, who they're dating, etc. Close quote. Some celebrities capitalize on this by attempting to sell you the products that they are using, either directly through their own brand or directly by advertising for a brand. Consequently, I too was, quote, pleasantly surprised at how Leonardo DiCaprio presents himself in a humble and approachable way and learns and grows with the audience rather than coming off as pretentious, close quote. DiCaprio's celebrity may have been what drew people to the documentary, but he and the filmmakers do a great job of presenting him as just another person who will be impacted by the climate crisis. Of course, given what we know about the climate crisis, he will be impacted less than most people on the planet. Still, his concern is heartening. Given the enormity of the climate crisis, it's altogether surprising that more celebrities are not speaking out about it. This is, I think, rather disheartening. In other words, once a person achieves celebrity, most use their products to sell some sort of product or another rather than leveraging it to do good, in the world. Sure, they may have pet causes, but it is rare to find someone with DiCaprio's commitment, as he has been actively working to educate the public about the climate crisis for 2 decades now. So the next quote. While I agree that DiCaprio works hard to travel the world for this film, we should be reminded that this travel adds to DiCaprio's carbon footprint, close quote. While I'll definitely take the point here, especially regarding air travel, it's worth noting that this sort of about this kind of whole critique for a moment. In response to a previous comment, I noted that if Leonardo Dicaprio and Greta Thunberg, if you pop your head up and call for action on the climate crisis, you present yourself as a target for someone to smack down. Although there are various ways that people are smacked down, there is one that is particularly effective, drawing attention to their actions that are in conflict with the message. In short, calling them a hypocrite. For example, a climate activist flying on a plane or having a burger. In so doing, not only is the attack made personal, but the focus shifts away from the message, which is often then completely forgotten, to rather focus on the messenger. In terms of the climate crisis, as activist Naomi Klein succinctly notes, quote, if you can't be an activist unless you have already somehow purged your whole life of fossil fuels, then you're going to have a movement of 3 people, close quote. In terms of the previous comment about celebrity, it is doubtful that there are many celebrities living especially sustainable lives. Hence, as Klein notes, calling people hypocrites is, quote, an incredibly effective way to repel, close quote, potential activists. This form of attack is incidentally widespread. For example, the New York Post ran an article that, quote, gas-guzzling car rides expose AOC's hypocrisy among Green Deal pledge, close quote. As the article noted, quote, even though the subway station was just 138 feet from her campaign office, AOC chose not to use mass transit, but instead used Uber, Lyft, Juno, and other car services. If you look hard enough, I suspect that you will find that nearly every climate activist is in some way a, quote, hypocrite. Shifting from the message to the messenger is a doubly effective strategy, as it keeps potentially important messengers out of the game. If they are brave enough, perhaps we should say foolish enough, to use their platform to help with the climate crisis, their hypocrisy will become the news story rather than the climate crisis. As we shall see throughout Climate Crisis 101, fossil fuel affiliates and climate change deniers have developed a number of highly effective and often vicious ways of shutting down the climate change conversation. The following comment was made in response to another student who felt that Before the Flood was too much of an oversimplification of the climate crisis. Quote, I agree that the movie oversimplifies the climate crisis. However, I think that this makes this documentary, what makes it great is that it is made to draw people into environmentalism. My 57-year-old grandpa, who barely believes the climate change is real, doesn't want the same in-depth 6-hour movie describing all the socio-politic intricacies of climate change and the science behind it. He would immediately turn off a documentary that started with, quote, the earth is its own autonomous being, that we have disrespected it for too long. But he sat through the whole hour and a half with me, and by the end, he had so many questions. We literally talked about this movie and the climate crisis for hours. Without a movie such as this one, which eases the viewer into the situation, he would never have listened to me, close quote. Yeah, what a wonderful endorsement for Before the Flood and this approach. Since this is the first documentary for Climate Crisis 101, it is worth noting that many people have observed that watching with friends and family can not only make watching more fun, but often leads to, as this comment notes, interesting and thought-provoking discussion. Because, as this comment also aptly notes, or documentaries were generally designed to, quote, draw people into environmentalism. They are, relatively speaking, I hope anyhow, easy to watch, even for someone's grandfather, as they are neither too long or too esoteric. So the next comment. Al Gore's An Inconvenient sequel was very interesting to me because it really resonated with me, many of the speeches that he gave, especially the final speech in which he compared the movement to curb climate change to the women's right movement and women's rights movement, and similar movements. A quote which especially stuck with me was, quote, "No other country can play the role that the U.S. can play in the environmental movement to curb climate change," close quote. I think that America, a developed country with lots of resources and power, should be doing a lot more to lead the green movement than it is doing, well, right now. While America is not stepping up to the plate in this green movement, other countries and other leaders are. One such example is Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, who stated that, quote, this is Justin Trudeau, Canada's government is making climate change a top priority, close quote. And that's the end of the student's comment. Other countries are already well on their way to combating the climate crisis, and not without problems. Germany has been called the world's first major renewable economy. Similar renewable energy in Costa Rica supplied about 98% of the electrical energy output for the entire nation, and that was back in 2016. In terms of wealth, and that's GDP per capita, Costa Rica ranks relatively low among nations. It's number 50, and yet it's already at this level of renewable saturation. Incidentally, the GDP per capita of the U.S. is more than 4 times that of Costa Rica. Just something to think about. Okay, thanks.